Growing pains. 7 years had passed in the house of Hangvyut. Nation built a beautiful 6-story pagoda when his wife and queen, Waco, became ill. It was a tiered tower made of the finest bamboo from the Angie forest, wood, brick and stone all tinted in an emerald-colored dye. The exterior resembled a gargantuan green vine rising to the sky. Nation's designers also crafted the exterior to look as if there were 6 eaves, but the interior of the pagoda was hollow. The tiered roofs and shingles were accented in a blood-red hue. The mat that completely covered the floor was topped with a dazzling white mink material. Hand-carved wooden candlesticks were wound on the floor in a cyclone-like pattern so that anyone hoping to reach the middle had to walk in circles to get to the center. In the center of the pagoda there were 3 abstract statues, figures of men carved out of massive blocks of cherry wood. Beside the statues were ornately carved wooden sticks used to hold cast-iron trays to burn incense. In the geometric center of the pagoda sat 4 kneeling stands for prayer. Nation prayed for Waco every night in the pagoda. He would meticulously light every candle in the winding path towards the center. The warm golden glow of several hundred candles and the richness of the green and blood-red colors gave the pagoda an otherworldly ambience. Nation liked it. He believed the energy of his prayers and light would cure his beloved wife. He was wrong. Waco died after a painful battle with a sudden but crippling condition. The prayer pagoda was the pride of the house of Hangvyut. Although he was moving on in age, Nation would kneel on the cold stone floor and sit on his knees using only a thin blanket he carried with him to protect his aching knees from the cold, scratchy floor. It was his routine to sit in the center of the pagoda for many hours, without moving a muscle or saying one word aloud. Tannar sat beside his father, King Nation. Tannar had grown to be a strong-willed, mostly arrogant young man of 22 years. Tannar was sure that by age 14 he would have proven himself a man in every sense of the word. He was boyishly handsome but possessed a roguish quality and devilish smile that made him the favorite of all the young maidens in the castle. His sun-kissed skin was the color of champagne and he was lean to the point of seeming almost too skinny, but his muscles were firm and he was blessed with natural athletic ability. As Tannar sat beside his aging father, he realized he was missing his favorite pastime, training with Zan, the chief member of Nation's war council. Zan was a powerful warrior and Tannar hoped Chen would soon help him transform into a formidable warrior as well. Tannar's athleticism served him well against Zan, who taught him the discipline of martial arts, the power of one's will in wrestling and perfection of swordplay with both the Jian and the Dao. At that moment, Tannar felt none of the excitement he'd felt when sparring against Zan. There was no battle he was on the verge of winning, or losing, with a single blow. His muscles did not ache from overexertion. His joints did not crack from overextension. His clothing was neither soaked in sweat nor stained with blood as sometimes happens when Zanna's sword missed its mark by millimeters. His pulse ran quiet and his heartbeat did not thunder in his ears. Tannar was bored and it was the most excruciating pain he'd felt since he broke his arm when he was 13. He fidgeted beside his Nation. His eyes wandered to a flickering candle flame, a praying mantis rummaging for grubs, a beetle scurrying away, praying the mantis hadn't seen it yet. He threw a pebble at the beetle and it thudded as it ricocheted off a candlestick. Nation groaned. His little boy wasn't little anymore. He was becoming more headstrong with each passing day. Nation took a deep, calming breath and let it out slowly. He kept his hands pressed together in front of his face. "Do you know to whom we pray, Tannar?" he asked quietly. Tannar shrugged. Being questioned was worse than wasting 3 hours praying. He hated being asked why and to whom he was praying. "We pray to the gods and goddesses of the immortal paradise." Tannar rolled his eyes as he blandly recited the words. "The spirits of the Black Mountain who protect the Black Wildwood, for it protects us from our enemies." Blah, 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 he thought to himself. Satisfied, Nation nodded, but this incensed Tannar. He stood to his feet, looming over Nation. Unseen by Tannar, an older statesman, known simply as Elder, limped into the pagoda. His long ponytail had become white and arid with age and he bent over as he walked, but he dressed well. Tannar glared at his father with the anger and frustration known only to parents and their children. "You pray while the raiders attack more of our villages." His tone was authoritative and condescending. They murder women and children like beasts with no honor, and we do nothing. We must strike back." With strength and agility belying his age, Nation moved from sitting on his knees to standing in one swift, smooth motion. He lowered his hands and turned to Tannar. He had deep wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, but they were otherwise soft and loving. "Tannar," he said gently, "we know nothing about the raiders or their numbers. What should we do? Send 100 of our men against 1,000 of theirs? 1,000 men sent against 10,000? Should we quench our thirst for revenge with the blood of our brothers?" Tannar pouted as he shook his head. "You treat me as a child," he accused. "I am a man. I am heir to the throne, and I have a say in what happens to the kingdom. Moreover, I demand my birthright, father." Nation gazed at him knowingly. He'd had this conversation with Tannar 100 times in the past 3 years. Tonight it would end no differently. "You are almost a man, and yes, you are heir to the throne. But I swore to your mother that I would never teach you twisting dagger. It is the way of war." Tannar flew into a temper tantrum. "Are you blind, father? We are at war now. War with the raiders. War with Kaelin. Meditation and prayers will not change that." Elder stepped out of the shadows and confronted Tannar. "Do not set siege to your father's love so recklessly, boy." He chastised Tannar. "With your mother's last breath she required the king's promise. Would you have him betray his oath to a dying woman? We are under siege, old man." Tannar retorted smugly. "A forgotten oath is the least of my concerns, especially if we cannot protect our people." Nation signed. There was no getting through to Tannar when he was like this. He was stubborn, like his mother, and arrogant like his father used to be many decades ago. Whatever his personality was, Tannar had been given these gifts honestly and organically from his parents. Nation could not be angry. He loved and adored his Soon. Nation laid his hands on Tannar's shoulders and looked him in the eye. Regardless of Tannar's harsh words, there was still nothing but love and compassion in Nation's eyes. "I have heard you," Nation assured Tannar. "I promise, I have listened. But enough is enough. An oath is an unbreakable bond. Come pray with me, Tannar." Tannar jerked away and cut between the rows of candlesticks to exit the pagoda. At the doorway he stopped and turned back. "Prayers are for the dead and the dying," he said sternly. "I am neither. An oath is an unbreakable bond, my son." Nation repeated. "Does an oath create a bond more unbreakable than that of father and son?" he asked. "If that be true, my father is therefore dead to me, King Nation." Tannar's words were ripe with disappointment and ceremony. There was a hint of regret in his eyes, and his words hung in the air for an eternity. Nation's face remained expressionless, and the pleading Tannar expressed in his furrowed brow transmogrified into something hateful and mean. Tannar shook his head with distaste, spun on his heels and stormed off without another word. He was fairly confident that his father had not seen the tears rolling down his cheek. Over the years Mieko had grown into her role as princess of the Nyansvit province. She relished the attention and respect showered upon her by everyone, but she was also known as a benevolent young woman who cared about her subjects. She'd inherited that trait from Shayla. As a princess, she was often called to attend events in and around the castle more for public relations than anything else. Kaelin was deplorable at these events, and typically Shayla would take his place. However, with Diemori at her side, Shayla no longer left the castle for events. Diemori was forbidden from crossing the castle threshold and venturing outside. Shayla opted to stay with Diemori while Mieko performed statesman duties. Mieko and Diemori had grown up side by side. Shayla and Eilin had made sure the two girls spent as much time together as was possible considering how polarized their positions were. Shayla kept Diemori safely away from traditional servant duties, but she relished the opportunity to contribute by handling all the chores Shayla, Eilin, or the triplets could send her way. Meanwhile, Mieko would be thoroughly engaged in royal activities or training with Kaelin in the way of the rising sword. As soon as the girls were done with their chores and duties, they'd race into each other's arms again. Aside from a few tedious distractions, Mieko and Diemori were inseparable. Within the castle walls, the sight of Shayla and Diemori, side by side, Marching through the great hall or making a quick stop in the great room was a familiar sight. But gone were the typical mother and daughter silhouettes, or images of Shayla kneeling to be eye to eye with D'Amory. By her 18th birthday, D'Amory was 2 inches taller than Shayla. She had grown into a lovely, strong, and effervescent woman. She smiled often, loved to sit and chat with the servants and the warriors who protected the castle. She found beauty and spectacle in everything. Her throaty laughter was infectious, and she provided levity in the castle even through the increasing alarm at the rampant pace of attacks by raiders. D'Amory would walk through the castle in her dark robe, hooded cloak, and black silk veil arm in arm with Empress Shayla. It was only when Kaelin was nearby that D'Amory would take a servant's position 5 paces behind the queen. Shayla marched through the stately hall bordering the inner court where Kaelin would soon be training Mieko again. D'Amory followed 5 paces behind her. As they came upon Safford, he stepped aside silently. Shayla passed him without a word. D'Amory stopped, faced Safford and bowed deeply and respectfully. "Greeting, Master Safford." D'Amory's eyes curled up at the edges and Safford knew she was smiling. "I trust your day has gone exceptionally well." Safford bowed even deeper to show his respect for this glorious child. "The blessings of my day are complete, now that we have spoken, D'Amory," he responded. His eyes narrowed and his lips curled upward as his typically grim face contorted into a smile. D'Amory had to dash to catch up to Shayla, who was nearly 20 paces ahead of her. She took her place 5 steps to the rear and they continued in tandem until Xiao, a servant from the kitchen, came in the opposite direction. Xiao stepped aside and looked downward as Shayla passed. D'Amory stopped in front of Xiao and bowed again. "I wish you all good things, Mistress Xiao," D'Amory stated firmly, but there was a lilt to her voice that made Xiao chuckle. "Exactly as I wish for you, D'Amory." Xiao bowed in return as she smiled and grasped D'Amory's hands briefly for good measure. D'Amory looked ahead and saw that Shayla had stopped walking and was standing in the middle of the intersection where the corridor crossed a small passageway to the gardens at the rear of the castle. She had turned back and was watching Xiao and D'Amory, and she was clearly irritated. Xiao took note and scrambled off. D'Amory dashed ahead to catch up to Shayla as another servant rounded the corner. D'Amory stopped mid-step and bowed. "Hello, mistress," she started. "D'Amory," Shayla said, firmly. "Must you stop to greet everyone?" she firmly inquired as the servant took advantage of the queen's distraction to run away in the opposite direction. D'Amory tilted her head to the side, puzzled by the queen's query. "But it makes them happy," she said plainly. "I appreciate their presence, mother. Do you not see the smiles on their faces?" Shayla considered it for a second. How could she expect anything different from D'Amory, she asked herself. D'Amory had a sense of empathy that latched on to those around her, and compassion compelled her to take action, regardless of the risk or inconvenience. Shayla brushed aside her irritation and tucked her hands into the sleeves of shirt on the opposite sides. "Very well." D'Amory marched up behind her and they started down the hall again. Shayla could see through her peripheral vision that D'Amory's face was aglow with a huge smile. "If only the world could see her beauty as I do," Shayla thought. A warrior approached in lacquered blue and red armor. His sword was in its sheath and his bronze shield tucked under his arm. He saw the queen and threw his back against the wall to give her as much room as she needed. Shayla noticed his eyes flitter towards D'Amory and he stifled a smile as he lowered his head and eyes. "Hello, Master Wu." Shayla's voice boomed, full of authority, and it boomed in the tight passageway. Wu stumbled forward, pushed himself back against the wall and dropped his shield. He mustered an uneasy smile before he bowed. Then he snatched his shield from the floor, backed away a few steps, then spun and marched off. D'Amory watched in amazement as Wu trotted away nervously and quickly disappeared down the corridor. Shayla stood silently, taking a few moments to consider the events that just took place. She turned to D'Amory and very dryly uttered, "It will take time for me to master this process of greeting subjects," she admitted. D'Amory chuckled her agreement. "First thing, mother," she said, "do not think of them as subjects. They are like your family." Shayla nodded. "A valid point," she said, and then suddenly grabbed D'Amory's hand. "We must hurry. They dashed down the hallway and stopped at the entrance to the tiny passageway that led to the secret room above the great hall. Go, Shayla said quickly. The king has already begun training with Mieko. Shayla nodded her blessing. They exchanged quick hugs and Diamori slipped into the narrow opening. Diamori followed the ever-thinning passageways until she found the secret room above the inner courtyard. She rolled out a mat that she'd been using for years and laid prone on the floor, looking down through the barred window at the edge of the floor and the wall. Below her she could see Kaylin and Mieko. He was standing behind Mieko as she struck a pose with her Gen sword that resembled a crane stretching out its wing. To the untrained eye the movement looked correct, but Diamori knew by Kaylin's expression that he was not pleased with Mieko's progress. Diamori shook her head. It wasn't often that she witnessed the king's disapproval of anything related to Mieko. It was hard not to feel satisfied that she wasn't the only one incapable of pleasing the king at every turn. She'd made up her mind a long time ago to simply stay out of the king's way. If Kaylin had an event that required Shayla and her stable of servants, of which Diamori was considered a member, she would keep her distance. Of course she still stole glances at the king and marveled at his power and authority. However, over the years she had gotten more adept at hiding it. Still, seeing the king upset with Mieko was unsettling and Diamori had to fight the emotions welling up inside of her. She wasn't sure exactly what she was feeling, but she knew that if her feelings were manifested to certain people in the castle, like Fulson, she would be in a great deal of trouble. Diamori shook off the feelings of dread and focused on Mieko. Mieko was flawless. The years had done good things for her. She'd grown up into a beautiful and regal princess. Maturity and years of training with Kaylin had helped her lose the childish figure she had as an adolescent. She was now lean, toned and strong. Her skin was lightly tanned from working out in the sun, but her hair had retained the lush ebony color and full-bodied thickness from her youth. Even in her sweaty frock Mieko was a beauty to behold. Diamori watched as Mieko tried a thrusting lunge with her sword several times. Kaylin corrected her each time and bellowed loudly so she could repeat the movement after several more tries. Kaylin snatched the sword away. He became even more exasperated as he watched Mieko struggle with the footwork even without her sword. Where is your focus, Mieko? Kaylin's voice was raised and his tone was curt and emotionless. Mieko flopped down on the floor. She was tired. She was always tired after her training sessions, but Kaylin had made her repeat several attack thrusts all day. But this time she was physically and emotionally exhausted. She was sure she'd repeated the moves over 100 times. It is difficult, father. Mieko protested. Mother is raising me to be a princess, yet you turn me into a warrior. To do both seems impossible. Nonsense, Kaylin corrected. His voice was firm but possessed a gentle lilt to accentuate the softness of his eyes. You are my daughter, he continued. You can master this if you concentrate and work harder. Mieko stared at her father. For a brief moment, she didn't breathe, didn't move, and didn't even bat an eyelash. It wasn't a show of defiance, she was simply mesmerized by the change in Kaylin. In fact, little else had changed about Kaylin except his demeanor. The years had been kind to him, how many years manifested only in the additional crow's feet at the corners of his eyes. Otherwise, Kaylin looked as formidable as always. He hadn't softened, exactly, but he had found a soft spot in his heart, an emptiness that Mieko filled easily. She was not Shayla, she did not challenge him at every waking moment. Instead, she spent the last 6 years appealing to a side of Kaylin that he thought was lost. With Mieko, Kaylin was able to smile, laugh, and tease. He was playful, and that helped ease his mind of the abundance of troubles brewing in the province of Nyansvit and beyond. As Mieko stared at her father, she wondered if there was anything at all that she could do to reignite the love Kaylin and Shayla once savored. But as quickly as the thought came, it went away. She knew better than to meddle in the affairs of kings and queens. Do you hear me, Mieko? Kaylin repeated. You must focus. Mieko bowed to acquiesce. As she rose, her eyes shined up at Kaylin like the sun, and her radiant beauty made him take a step back. His mood changed immediately and he lowered his voice and altered his cadence to speak softly. If only your technique matched your beauty, Mieko, he almost whispered. You have grown into such an exquisite young woman. It is difficult for me to believe that not all things come easy for you." He was almost gushing at this point, and he adjusted to give himself time to look impassive and unaffected. "Thank you, father," Mieko uttered apologetically. "I shall train night and day. I will not disappoint you again." She lifts the sword and attempts the thrust attack several times as Kaylin watches adoringly. After several attempts that show no signs of improvement, Kaylin reaches for the sword in a gesture that tells Mieko that training is over. She hands him the sword and lowers her head in embarrassment. Kaylin put his bent forefinger under her chin and lifted her head. When her eyes met his, she smiled. She smiled because Kaylin was already smiling. "Someday you will melt the cold heart of a battle-hardened warrior. Such is the honor of a woman of a royal line." Mieko curtsied to show her appreciation. "Is that what mother did to you?" she quizzed. As soon as the words left her mouth, she regretted ever saying them. Kaylin took a step back. He was caught off guard and he couldn't take the easy way out and resort to the absolute truth. His eyes went to the floor momentarily as he gathered his thoughts and the appropriate politically correct response. "That was very long ago," he stated without inflection in his tone. "I dare not remember such things." He couldn't mask the loneliness in his voice, and for the first time Mieko felt sorry for her father. Kaylin was, in fact, very alone. The time he took to train Mieko was the only time he ever spent with his family. Mieko realized why their training sessions had ballooned over the years, from 2 hours to 3, and now 4. Kaylin was using Mieko to erase the memory of Shayla. "I dare not remember such things," he'd said. It was because any memory of Shayla caused him pain. It was a pain no amount of physical conditioning or acrobatic prowess could thwart. It was a pain that went straight to his heart and hung there like a dagger in an open wound, siphoning every drop of his spirit. "Father," she was finally able to say. "Why are you and mother so distant from each other?" Again she caught Kaylin off guard. He stared. He dared not speak at the moment for fear of stammering like an idiot. When he had resigned himself to speak, Falson, his trusted monk and advisor, appeared out of nowhere. "King Kaylin," Falson bellowed, interrupting the king before he could speak. "Your provincial representatives need your wisdom in the Great Hall." Kaylin sighed with relief. "Alas, the vexing duties of nobility save me from my beloved daughter's cruel questioning." "I did not mean to be cruel to you, father," Mieko retorted, defending herself. Kaylin moved closer and placed a sweet kiss on her forehead. He looked her in the eyes and smiled again, and then he turned and walked away. Mieko waited until he shut the door behind him, and then she dropped to the floor, removed her slipper and started massaging her sore feet. She didn't realize that Falson was still behind her, watching her every move with dancing eyes, and leering lustfully. Mieko may not have noticed Falson, but above the two of them, in the secret narrow room with barred windows, Dimori watched Falson closely. She noticed everything about him, his eyes, his hands, his drooling mouth, and his twitching fingers. She saw everything and she did not like it. As Falson's lustful gaze lingered over Mieko, Dimori seemed to get angrier. Then an odd thing happened. Falson turned his head and he looked directly at Dimori. His movement seemed sudden and purposeful, and it scared Dimori. She ducked away and flattened her back against the wall. Her chest heaved with nervous energy and her eyes darted back and forth. Did Falson see her? Full of fear and angst, Dimori scurried out of the room, through the halls and passageways and out into the great hall. She was just starting to stifle her panic as she rounded a corner and ran headfirst into Safford. Safford was a powerfully built man. Dimori bounced off his solid chest like a rubber ball and fell back on her buttocks. She was on her feet in a flash, checking to make sure her veil and hood hadn't fallen out of place and revealed any part of her skin. "Forgive me, Master Safford." She apologized quickly. "I was distracted. How clumsy of me." Safford guffawed like a jolly old man twice his age. His smile beamed like sunshine and he reached out to soothe Dimori with a touch on her shoulder. "Clumsy? You? I have seen how you move through the passages of this castle, with a grace that belies any servant," he said soothingly. He looked closer and could see the nervousness in her face. A glance at her hands and he was convinced she was trembling. "Hold," "Little one. What makes you so uneasy? Surely not me." He was right. Safford was known to be one of the kindest warriors in the castle. Tales of his powerful wins in brutal battles paled in comparison to stories of how generous an individual he was. There was no way dear Marie could claim she was nervous about him. She'd spent many hours in his presence in the great hall. Even though she was fully covered in her dark cloak and veils, she felt comfortable with him. Shayla had even left her in his care for short periods when she had to attend to matters with Mieko and Eilin wasn't available. Master Safford, dear Marie stalled as her mind worked to devise a clever ruse. She wasn't used to fabricating stories. "I believe I may be late in drawing a bath for the princess. In my haste I hardly noticed you." Safford stepped closer. "It is a wonder you noticed me at all dressed in that cloak and veil," he said. His eyes were examining her garment, trying to get a better vantage point to see her face. "I must confess, when you were a child scurrying through the castle in the robe and veil, I thought it a child's game. But now you are a young woman and the robe survives. Tell me, why do you wear it?" Dear Marie had no idea how to fabricate a story. She knew why she wore the veil, cloak and hood. However, if she confessed to anyone, she would violate the king's orders never to show her skin color. She didn't know what else to say, so she started to back away. Her heart was racing and all she could think to do was to run away. "I wear this because the king commands it," she offered. "I have assumed as much for many years. Still, you have not answered my question as to why." Suddenly Fulson appeared out of nowhere. It was the same way he appeared in the inner courtyard behind Kaelin and Mieko. His presence was so immediate and overwhelming that dear Marie almost vomited under her veil. "Master Safford!" Fulson shouted. "How insensitive of you to bully her to confess such ugly things about herself. Does she admit to being a visual abomination?" The insult hurt dear Marie and her immediate defense was to roll her eyes at Fulson. Safford noticed her defiance and smiled at her. "I offer my humble apologies," he said. "I did not mean to offend you. I do not see a so-called abomination. I only ever witness the sweetness of your spirit." Safford bowed to dear Marie and departed. Dear Marie started walking behind him, past Fulson. "I must attend to the princess," she said softly. Her voice was choked with fear. "Of course," Fulson replied stonily. Fulson stepped aside to allow dear Marie to pass, but as soon as she walked by him he shoved her against the wall. He untied the belt around her robe, lifted the skirt and forcefully jammed his hand between her legs. Dear Marie was blinded with pain that radiated from her crotch to her eyes. She started to scream but thought better of it. The delay gave Fulson time to cover her mouth. "How dare you smirk at me, slave?" he huffed nastily in her ear. "Step out of place again and I shall introduce you to more than my finger." He removed his hand from her mouth. She was sobbing as she choked on her words. "I am sorry. I am sorry. Please." Fulson shoved her to the floor and sashayed off without so much as a backward glance. Dear Marie curled into the fetal position and wept into her cloak. As she lay there she suddenly remembered all the horrible nightmares she had as a child. She could see Fulson's face as clear as the sun. He was the tormentor in her dreams. Every vision, every physics-defying chase, every bloody sequence, there was Fulson at the center of it all. Dear Marie wanted to sit motionless, hopeless and cry forever, but she knew she couldn't. If someone else noticed her weeping, she would be asked what happened. If it came to that, she would be putting the queen in jeopardy. She had no reason to be there, and if anyone found out that Shayla had secretly shown her the secret room to spy on Kaelin, the king would be outraged. No. She could not lie there and weep. There was only one thing left to do. She needed to ignore the pain radiating down her legs and up her back, get up and quietly walk back to the queen's bedchamber. As she stood, a sharp pain shot down her leg. She reached under her robe, between her legs. She grimaced from the sting as she touched her nether region. When she withdrew her hand, she was horrified at the sight of fresh blood on her fingertips. This was worse than she imagined. She started to panic. Her chest heaved as she hyperventilated and her eyes darted left and right. She wasn't sure if she was looking for help, for escape, or to make sure no one was present to bear witness to her shame. Dear Marie eased to her feet, steadied herself. She took 4 slow and deep breaths to quiet her heavy breathing. She pulled her cloak tighter, adjusted her veil and walked down the lonely corridor, trying desperately not to limp or give into the sharp pain that threatened to steal her consciousness. As luck would have it, she arrived at the bedchamber without running into Eilin, Empress Shayla, or Princess Mieko. As she stumbled into the room, she remembered there was a special training session called the Chinuyo tea ceremony Mieko had to attend. For many years Loaiza was the teacher responsible for training women of the nobility and the higher class maids the strict performance art of preparing powdered green tea. Now that Loaiza had moved on to the afterlife, the responsibility fell upon Eilin's shoulders. Eilin had made it her mission to help Mieko master the Chinuyo tea ceremony. Empress Shayla was with Mieko and Diemori knew that she would not be disturbed. Diemori checked the door and slid the wooden bolt across to keep anyone from entering. She disrobed, first her veil, then her hooded cloak, her gloves, and finally her robe. She stood there naked for a moment, shivering although the weather outside was balmy. She was starting to perspire and beads of sweat made her body glisten. She searched through a wooden credenza on the floor and found an emerald-colored silk kerchief with the provincial crest of Nyansvit at the corner. Beside the master bed she found a wooden bucket of water. Shayla used the kerchief to wrangle her long locks when she first arose from bed, and the bucket was used to freshen her face. Diemori dipped the cloth into the bucket, squeezed most of the water out and braced herself. Her eye fell upon the area between her legs and she started to cry. This time the tears did not stop. She reached down with the silk kerchief and cupped her womanhood. The pain was blinding and her head tilted towards the sky and her eyes shut tightly. The muscles in her face worked as she clenched her jaw. After a few moments she breathed again. She repeated her actions twice more, in the very same manner. When Diemori was done she tucked the kerchief into the pockets of her robe and climbed under the thick mink blanket on the queen's bed. She fell asleep in seconds but periodically cried throughout the night.